You've seen this before, but you never really noticed it. You've walked past it every day, maybe on your way to work, maybe on your way to school, maybe turning the same corner on the same street over and over again, maybe with a coffee in your hand, maybe staring at your phone, maybe in a rush, maybe without thinking about anything at all. And the whole time, the city was showing you something, quietly, repeatedly, right in front of you. But you didn't see it. Because some things don't become invisible because they're hidden. Some things become invisible because they're too familiar. The human mind loves order. It loves what it already knows. It sees something, gives it a label, files it away, and never looks at it again. When something repeats enough times, it stops feeling important. It becomes background. It becomes noise. It becomes part of the set. It becomes something you stop questioning. And sometimes, that's exactly how the biggest story gets buried. Not by being hidden, by becoming normal. So now I want you to do one thing. Picture your next walk outside, but this time, don't look up. Don't look at the tops of buildings. Don't look at domes, rooftops, towers, signs, or lights. Don't look at the big, dramatic things the city uses to sell itself to you. Look down. Look at street level. Look at the line where the sidewalk meets the wall. Look at the stone right next to where your feet land every single day. Because sometimes the whole story doesn't begin in the most impressive place. Sometimes it begins at the lowest point. At first, you won't see anything. That's normal. Because your eyes move fast, and your mind moves even faster. It scans a surface and says, building, wall, glass, keep going. That's how you've been trained to look. Notice the big structures. Listen to the big events. Focus on the big story. But cities don't always reveal themselves through monuments. Sometimes they give themselves away through small fractures. So look for one more second, slow down a little, and then you'll start to notice them. Openings that look cut in half, arches sliced by the line of the street, stone frames buried into the lower part of a wall, shapes that look like they used to be fully exposed, but today only the top part is still visible. Some still have glass, some are just dark, empty spaces. Some are covered with iron bars. Some have lost everything except their form, their proportion, their intention. And right there, something starts to feel strange. Because these don't look like random holes. They look like they once had a relationship with the outside world. Openings that let in light, that let in air, that let people look out, that opened from the outside in. And yet today, they sit below street level. That is where the story really begins. Because in that moment, your mind steps in. And your mind immediately wants to label it. Old detail, architectural leftover, probably some useless opening. And the moment that label sticks, the question gets smaller. Curiosity fades. Tension disappears. But in this video, we're not going to accept that label, because maybe what you're looking at is not what you first thought it was. For a moment, stop looking at those openings like windows. Look at them like traces, like something left behind, like something sitting inside the wall, but older than the wall itself, like the last visible edge of another space that continues further down. Maybe these aren't just openings. Maybe they're breathing points. Maybe they're ventilation shafts. Maybe they're the final visible signs of a room, a corridor, a gallery, or a passage below. Because cities, especially old cities, do not leave openings in walls for no reason. If there's an opening, there's usually a space behind it. If there's a space, there's usually a function. And if there's a function, there's usually a story. And this is where the direction of the story changes. Because now the question is no longer, what kind of window is this? Now the question becomes, what is underneath it? And that question takes you away from the wall and straight underground. Under most cities, there is usually a second city. Sometimes we know that. Sometimes it's marked on signs. Sometimes it becomes a tourist route. Sometimes it becomes a museum. But most of the time, what we're seeing is only a small piece of the whole. Because the underground is never just one simple thing. It starts with corridors. It continues with cellars. It expands into cisterns, then into service spaces, drainage channels, passageways, sealed entrances, and forgotten galleries. And after a while, you start to realize something. What exists underneath a city is not just infrastructure. It's also memory. Silent memory, covered memory, renamed memory. Memory that was closed off, buried, and absorbed into whatever came later. And right here, we get our first major example. Istanbul. Even above ground, Istanbul doesn't feel like a city with just one layer. At the end of one street, you feel the Ottoman world. A few steps later, you feel Byzantium. Walk a little farther, and suddenly you're inside modern concrete. But sometimes the strangest part of Istanbul doesn't begin above ground, it begins below it. Think about everything that's been said for years about the spaces beneath Hagia Sophia. Passages, tunnels, galleries, voids, connections. In the 2022 survey reported by Anadolu Agency, underground tunnels and channels around Hagia Sophia, some around 1,500 years old, were mapped in 3D. The same study also mentioned a 4th century hypogeum discovered about 4 meters below the northeast side. And researcher Hasan Ferhat Dika explained that many of these underground spaces were likely built for systems like utilities, water management, and ventilation, even saying some of the tunnels are so narrow that breathing inside them is difficult. So in this case, we have two things at once: real underground structures and a real technical explanation for many of them. Now think about Rome. In Rome, the story grows downward in a similar way. Years ago, city officials and geologists began mapping the wide underground tunnel systems and tough quarry networks beneath Rome. Because it isn't just the structures above ground that matter. The voids, galleries, and old underground routes below them shape the city too. And Rome's underground story isn't only technical. Passages like the Passetto del Borgo, known as an escape route for popes, have even been reopened and visited again. So the underground network there is not just a rumor, it is a real layer of the city, partly visible, partly hidden, but undeniably there. But is this only true for ancient imperial cities? Let's look at New York, the city of modernity, speed, skyscrapers, steel, and constant vertical growth. But even New York didn't grow only upward. Beneath it are active lines, abandoned stations, unused platforms, service passages, and forgotten transportation layers. One of the most striking examples is Old City Hall, which opened in 1904 and is no longer an active station. According to the New York Transit Museum, it closed in 1945, but still functions as a turning point for the 6 train. In other words, even beneath the most modern cities, there is another map still living below the surface, even if it no longer belongs to everyday life. And that's why this is not just the weirdness of one city. The real question is this: why do major cities keep revealing a second layer beneath them? Why does life above ground almost always seem to rest on top of another order below? And those openings, those half-cut arches, those traces below street level, are they really just random leftovers? At this point, we need to be honest. Because the official explanation is not meaningless. In fact, in some cities, it is extremely strong. Cities really do rise over time. Roads get rebuilt, street levels change, fill gets added, fires happen, destruction happens, sewer systems change, drainage needs change, and new surfaces are added. And sometimes that process is so clear that there's almost nothing left to argue about. Chicago is one of the strongest examples. Because of the city's low, muddy ground and drainage problems, parts of downtown were raised in the 1850s and 1860s. Official Illinois tourism sources describe sections being elevated by anywhere from 4 to 14 feet, affecting buildings, roads, and sidewalks across the urban fabric. Even more interesting, period accounts show that daily life didn't fully stop while buildings were being lifted. That part of Chicago tells us something important. Yes, cities really can be raised in a very literal sense. Seattle gives us another example. The Seattle Municipal Archives describe the Denny Hill regrade as a process that began in 1898 and lasted more than 3 decades, reshaping a major hill and changing the level of key streets. So in some cities, the sentence, "the old level was left below," isn't speculation at all. It's a documented engineering reality. So this video is not saying the official explanation is ridiculous. It's not. In fact, in some cases, it is very strong. Some lower levels really did end up below street level because the city itself was raised. Some tunnels really were built for ventilation and water management. Some passages really did come from practical, technical needs. And that is exactly why the question becomes even more interesting. Because if the official explanation works this well in some places, what if it doesn't fully work in others? What if we have the result, but not the same level of clarity in the explanation? What if in some examples, the sentence, "the city rose and the lower level was left behind," doesn't completely hold together? This is where the real doubt begins. Because what unsettles people is not the existence of an explanation. It's the fact that the same explanation doesn't fit every example equally well. Why do some of these openings look so aligned? Why do some facades feel like they were cut by the same invisible line? Why do some cities leave behind very clear results, but scattered or incomplete records? And even more importantly, why do some structures feel less like they simply ended up below grade, and more like they once belonged to a more open version of the city? That is where the phrase, "what if," enters the story. What if this is not only technical? What if in some cities, what we are seeing is not just the logic of infrastructure, but the trace of a larger disruption? I'm not making a final claim here, but a good story does not always move forward through certainty. Sometimes it moves forward through doubt that opens in the right place. And doubt is exactly what fuels this story. So let's push that doubt a little further, because sometimes images are more powerful than theories. Old photographs, archives, witness accounts, street views captured long before modern restoration, modern asphalt, and modern urban design flattened everything into the version we know today. And in those images, sometimes you notice something important. A level that looks buried today once looked completely normal. Full-height doors, open entrances, windows perfectly aligned with the street. A space that looks like a basement now, but functioned as ordinary street level then. And when you see images like that, history suddenly stops feeling academic. It drops to eye level. It becomes concrete. It becomes uncomfortable. Chicago gives us another powerful example here. There are accounts describing hotels being raised while guests were still inside them. One story even says that as the days passed, a customer noticed the entrance steps getting steeper and by the time he checked out, the windows were above his head. That kind of testimony matters, because it tells us two things at once. First, yes, cities really can be razed. And second, when something like that happens, it can leave behind witnesses, records, and stories that explain the change. And this is exactly where the tension gets stronger, because in some cities, we have witnesses, we have documents, we have photos, we have the engineering story. But in other cases, we have very clear physical results without the same clarity of narrative around them. In some places, the explanation is given from beginning to end. In others, all that remains is the trace. And that gap is what lingers in people's minds. That's why the central sentence of this video might be this: sometimes the problem is not that there is no explanation. The problem is that some explanations are incredibly clear, while others feel strangely incomplete. And it is inside that gap that a controversial theory begins to grow. Mud flood. For someone hearing the term for the first time, it can sound overly dramatic. But the theory itself describes something much quieter than a classic disaster movie. Not a wall of water tearing through a city, but a heavy covering of earth, mud, sediment, or fill material that buries lower levels, changes the surface, seals entrances, and leaves old structures trapped below a new ground line. And let's be very clear here, this is not an explanation accepted by mainstream history, and this video is not presenting it as proven fact. What it is saying is this: mud flood survives as a theory because it creates an unsettling sense of alignment with certain visual patterns. Not proof, not certainty, but a disturbing visual fit. The theory suggests that in some cities, lower levels may not have been buried only through slow, ordinary urban development. Maybe some structures were not destroyed. Maybe they were simply covered. Maybe some entrances were not removed. Maybe they were blocked by a new surface level. Maybe life shifted upward without completely erasing what came before. And then people did what they always do. They adapted. They opened new entrances. They sealed the old ones. They declared the new street level to be normal. And after a few generations, whatever remained below no longer felt mysterious. It just felt ordinary. And that is where the psychological power of the theory really lives. Because this is not only a claim about stone, it is a claim about memory, about how societies forget, about how what we call normal is sometimes not truth at all, but repetition. If something stays the same long enough, people stop questioning it. If an explanation is repeated enough times, the object stops feeling like a question. Seal an old entrance, build a road over it, give it a new name, assign it a new function, and after a few generations, the original purpose starts to feel like it never existed. That is what makes mudflood so compelling to some people, not just the idea of physical burial, but the suggestion of narrative burial too. And that is why people split. One side says no, most of this is normal urban evolution. The other side says, fine, maybe some of it is, but all of it? One side says there is no mystery here. The other side asks why some details still feel impossible to fully explain away. And honestly, that is what keeps people watching. Not a final answer, but the discomfort growing around one. So now think back through the path we just followed. First, we saw a trace. Then that trace led us to a void. The void led us to the idea of a passage. The passage took us underground. The underground led us to the layered structure of cities. That led us to the official explanation. The official explanation led us to the question, what if? That question opened into archives and witnesses, and the archives carried us all the way into a controversial theory. And now the story comes back to you. Because the real question at the end of this video is not just about Istanbul, or Rome, or New York. It's about your city. Have you seen openings like this where you live? Half-buried arches, lower-level windows, blocked entrances, vent-like voids sitting just under the street. Do you think all of them can be explained by ordinary urban elevation and infrastructure changes? Or do you think some cities may be carrying traces of a larger story that was never fully explained? And here is the bigger question. The level you're walking on right now, is it really the final level? Or one day, could someone else be looking at this same surface from below? Drop a comment and tell me, have you seen anything like this in your city? And do you think these are just infrastructure details, or signs of something larger still buried beneath the surface?